Now that I've talked about our three approaches to politics, I want to talk about how it lines up with our two political parties. So I'm going to do this from two directions. First, I'm going to talk about where each of our three perspectives would line up with the current political parties. Then I'll do the reverse, and I'll talk about how the political parties relate to the different perspectives. So let's start with conservatism. Where do you go if you're a conservative in the United States? Well, these days you pretty much go to the Republican Party. There's a few other small parties, but it tends to be, if you want one of the main political parties, it's the Republicans. Okay. Now, that's not totally true. Okay. There are many conservative Democrats. Right? That's becoming less true. From what I can tell, things to be sorting out. Particularly social conservatives have, over the last several decades, been moving more and more towards the political party, towards the Republican Party, for various reasons. So for the most part, we'll find conservatives in the Republican Party, but there are a good number of conservative Democrats. Libertarians tend to have a choice. If they're going to go with the major political party, it's the Republicans. To some extent, you might find some libertarians that will go with the Democrats because of the social issues, but libertarians tend to be associated with the Republican Party or the Libertarian Party. Of course, the Libertarian Party tends not to win elections. Right? So by default, if libertarians want to be involved with one of the major political parties, right, they tend to go with the Republicans. Okay. Liberals tend to be associated with the Democrats. Okay. So now let's look at it from the other perspective. How do we understand each of our two major political parties? Well, the Republican Party is split down the middle between conservatives and libertarians, and they don't always get along. Okay. In fact, we're going to discuss this in more detail later in the course. Okay. Late in the course, we're going to talk about debates between conservatives and libertarians. We'll talk about why they tended to form a political coalition from the close of World War II to the present day. We'll also talk about some of the discussions among libertarians and conservatives about whether they really have that much in common. I should also add that the two factions tend to have a lot of conflict within the Republican Party. But they also have another point that they agree on. Many conservatives and libertarians will complain that the Republican Party is often dominated by narrow economic interests. That is, libertarians and conservatives will both say that in many cases, the Republicans give in to a faction that is not libertarian in economic affairs, but at the same time isn't supporting the interests of the poor. Basically, they'll say the dominant factions in the Republican Party tend to do things that are in the interests of major corporations, whether or not those things are in the interest of the people as a whole. For example, the late Milton Friedman, a very libertarian economist, used to say, people in business are always in favor of economic liberty except for their favorite subsidy. That is, the subsidy that's helpful to their business. And many times, both social conservatives and libertarians will complain that the Republican Party ends up just supporting the economic interests of the corporations rather than standing on any kind of principle on social or economic affairs. Now let's look at the Democrats. Okay. For the most part, right, I would associate the Democrats with liberalism. And the Democrats tend not to be split down the middle in the same way. However, the Democrats are a very broad coalition. They tend to be a lot of different kinds of liberals, and they also have a lot of people in the party that are not quite so concerned with individual economic liberty, but heavily concerned with making progress in economic affairs. Right? That is, with having a greater amount of equality in economic affairs. There are also for various historical reasons, right, and for along with historical reasons, very understandable political desires and goals, other factions that aren't so socially conservative, right, but are concerned about the needs of the poor and working class people, right, that remain in the Democratic Party while being somewhat to the right of the mainstream of the Democratic Party on social issues. Okay. So you'll notice what I'm saying is both of these are very broad political tents. They tend to encompass a lot of different people, and there are tensions within each group. Right? The sort of polarization is maybe more noticeable in the Republican Party, right? And things are a lot more complex in the Democratic Party. Right? But both of them are very broad tents that encompass a lot of people with very different perspectives. And to some extent, that's a peculiarity of America and some other countries. Okay? We have a two-party system as opposed to a multi-party system that you might have in Australia or Britain or Canada. Right? That means that we end up lumping very disparate groups of people together into large political coalitions.